teacher threw blonde students' food away. Until Hell's Angel walked in, the morning sun filtered through the classroom windows as Elliot Sullivan sat at his desk, trying his best to focus on his math problems. But his mind kept wandering to the blue lunchbox tucked safely in his cubby. Inside was his absolute favorite meal in the whole world, his mom's perfectly crispy fried chicken. The familiar smell of the seasoned coating had filled their small kitchen that morning as his mother prepared it, despite the early hour. She always made sure to get up extra early on the days she made his special lunch, even though she worked late shifts at the diner. "One more hour," Elliot whispered to himself, sneaking a glance at the clock above the blackboard. His stomach growled softly, and he quickly pressed his hand against it, hoping nobody had heard. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The minutes ticked by slowly as Ms. Johnson went over fractions. Normally, Elliot enjoyed math. He was pretty good at it, too. But today, the numbers seemed to blur together as his thoughts drifted to lunch. He could almost taste the perfectly seasoned crust, the way it crackled when you bit into it, revealing the tender meat underneath. When the lunch bell finally rang, Elliot's heart leaped. He tried not to run as he made his way to his cubby, carefully pulling out his lunchbox. The other kids rushed past him, eager to get to the cafeteria, but Elliot took his time. This was his favorite part of the day, and he wanted to savor every moment of it. The cafeteria was already buzzing with activity when he walked in. The long tables were filled with students trading snacks and sharing stories about their morning classes. Elliot found his usual spot near the end of one of the tables, where he could eat in peace without drawing too much attention to himself. His fingers trembled slightly with excitement as he unzipped his lunchbox. The familiar scent of his mother's cooking wafted up, making his mouth water. She had packed 3 perfect pieces of golden brown chicken, wrapped carefully in wax paper. There was also a small container of coleslaw and a chocolate chip cookie. His mom always said every lunch needed something sweet. Elliot's face broke into a wide smile as he unwrapped the first piece. He could see the special herbs and spices his mom used dotting the crispy coating. She never told him exactly what went into her secret recipe, but he knew it was made with extra love. That's what made it taste so good. Just as he was about to take his first bite, a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Mrs. Green, the lunchroom supervisor, looming over him. Her thin lips were pressed into a tight line as she stared down at his lunch through her wire-rimmed glasses. "Fried chicken? Again?" Mrs. Green's voice carried across the cafeteria, making several nearby students turn to look. "Really, this is what passes for a proper lunch these days?" Elliot's cheeks grew warm as he lowered the chicken back to his wax paper. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, but he tried to keep his focus on his lunch, hoping Mrs. Green would move on to supervise someone else. "Such an unhealthy choice," she continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. "All that grease and fat, not to mention how unsophisticated it is." A few snickers echoed from the nearby tables. Elliot's ears burned red, but he kept his eyes down, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of the wax paper. His mother's perfectly cooked chicken, which had seemed so wonderful just moments ago, now felt like something to be ashamed of. Mrs. Green's shadow continued to loom over Elliot's table like a dark cloud. She drummed her perfectly manicured fingers against the surface, each tap making him sink lower in his seat. The cafeteria had grown quieter now, with more students turning to watch the scene unfolding before them. "In all my years of supervising lunch periods," Mrs. Green announced, her voice carrying across the room like a sharp knife, "I have never seen such an inappropriate lunch selection." She gestured dramatically at Elliot's carefully wrapped chicken. "This kind of greasy, unhealthy food is absolutely unfit for a child's lunch." Elliot's throat felt tight as he watched his classmates' reactions. Tommy Wilson, 2 tables over, elbowed his friend and whispered something that made them both laugh. Sarah Jenkins, who usually smiled at him during math class, quickly looked away when he caught her eye. "But my mom," Elliot started to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your mother, Mrs. Green, cut him off. Should know better than to send you to school with such common fare." She pronounced the word common as if it tasted bad in her mouth. "What kind of example does this set for the other students?" The fluorescent lights of the cafeteria seemed too bright now, and the room felt smaller than usual. Elliot could feel sweat forming on the back of his neck as Mrs. Green continued her lecture. "Look at this mess," she declared, pointing at the perfectly crispy chicken pieces. "Nothing but grease and empty calories. And the smell!" She wrinkled her nose in disgust. "It's permeating the entire cafeteria." Someone at the back of the room made chicken clucking sounds, and scattered laughter rippled through the students. Elliot's hands trembled under the table as he balled them into fists, trying to keep himself together. "This simply won't do," Mrs. Green announced. Without warning, she reached down and gathered up Elliot's lunch. The chicken his mother had woken up early to prepare, the coleslaw she had made fresh that morning, even the chocolate chip cookie she had packed as a special treat. "Mrs. Green, please!" Elliot's voice cracked as he reached out weakly, but she was already striding toward the large garbage bin by the cafeteria door. With an exaggerated gesture, she dropped everything into the trash. The sound of his lunch hitting the bottom of the bin seemed to echo through the now silent cafeteria. Elliot watched as his mother's loving effort disappeared beneath the shadow of the garbage can lid. "There," Mrs. Green said, brushing her hands together as if removing dirt. "That's much better. Perhaps tomorrow you'll bring something more appropriate." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Elliot alone with his empty lunchbox and the weight of everyone's stares. His face felt hot, and his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He could hear the whispers starting up around him, see the pointing fingers from the corner of his eye. His chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing it from the inside. Keeping his head down, Elliot stared at his empty place at the table, wishing he could disappear. The blue lunchbox his mother had bought him at the start of the school year, the one with race cars on it that he'd been so excited about, now seemed to mock him with its cheerful design. His hands shook as he slowly zipped it closed, each second feeling like an eternity as he tried to maintain his composure in front of his snickering classmates. The double doors of the cafeteria swung open with a loud creak. The sound cut through the whispers and snickers like a knife, drawing everyone's attention. A massive figure filled the doorway, blocking the fluorescent light from the hallway. The man who stepped in commanded attention without saying a word. His leather jacket bore the unmistakable patches of the hellsangels, and tattoos covered his muscular arms from wrist to shoulder. A thick, well-groomed beard framed his stern face, and his heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor with each step. The cafeteria fell into a deep silence. Even Mrs. Green, who had been smugly organizing her desk at the front of the room, froze mid-motion. The only sound was the quiet hum of the vending machines in the corner. Elliot kept his head down, not wanting to draw any more attention to himself. He could feel the shift in the room's energy as the stranger's boots clicked closer. Tommy Wilson, who had been making chicken noises just moments ago, suddenly became very interested in his sandwich. The man's presence seemed to fill the entire room. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the cafeteria until they landed on Elliot's table. Students who had been pointing and laughing earlier now stared at their lunches, trying to make themselves invisible. Sarah Jenkins dropped her fork, the clatter making several students jump. The man didn't even flinch. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why he was there. As he approached Elliot's table, Mrs. Green finally found her voice. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a closed campus. You'll need to check in at the main office." The man raised his hand slightly, silencing her with just that small gesture. His eyes remained fixed on Elliot, who was still studying the empty space where his lunch had been. The heavy boots stopped right next to Elliot's chair. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with surprising grace for such a large man, he knelt down beside Elliot's chair. His leather jacket creaked softly as he lowered himself to eye level with the boy. "Hey, buddy," the man said, his voice unexpectedly gentle and warm. "Don't let them get to you." Elliot's head snapped up at the familiar voice, his eyes wide with recognition. The man's stern expression softened into a kind smile that transformed his entire face. "Dad?" Elliot whispered, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. A collective gasp rippled through the cafeteria. Mrs. Green's face went pale, and several teachers who had been watching from the doorway exchanged worried glances. "That's right, son," the man said, placing a gentle hand on Elliot's shoulder. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several stunned onlookers before turning back to Elliot. "I'm Jack Sullivan, and I'm your father." The whispers started like a wave through the cafeteria. Students leaned close to each other, their eyes darting between Elliot and the imposing figure of Jack Sullivan. Some pointed discreetly, while others pulled out their phones, eager to text about the unexpected drama unfolding before them. "Did you know his dad was a Hell's Angel? Look at all those tattoos! I can't believe that's Elliot's father." Jack's hand remained steady on Elliot's shoulder as he slowly rose to his full height. His movement was deliberate, almost graceful despite his size. The leather of his jacket creaked as he turned to face Mrs. Green, who had recovered enough of her composure to lift her chin defiantly. "Mrs. Green," Jack's voice carried across the cafeteria without him having to raise it. "I understand you threw my son's lunch in the garbage." Mrs. Green's lips tightened into a thin line. "Mr. Sullivan, we have certain standards." "Standards?" Jack interrupted. His tone remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. "Standards that include humiliating an 8-year-old boy in front of his classmates?" The cafeteria grew even quieter, if that was possible. Even the usual clinking of utensils had stopped, as everyone watched the confrontation. Elliot sat straighter in his chair, drawing strength from his father's presence. "That meal you threw away," Jack continued, "was the last thing my son had to look forward to today. His mother works hard to provide for him, and that lunch was made with love." He took a step forward, his boots echoing in the silence. "I don't care who you think you are, but you will apologize to him. Now." Mrs. Green's face flushed red. She glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for support from the other staff members who had gathered at the edges of the cafeteria. Finding none willing to step forward, she cleared her throat. She began, then stopped. Jack's steady gaze never wavered. "I apologize, Elliot," she finally managed, though the words seemed to pain her. "I shouldn't have thrown away your lunch." Elliot nodded slightly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. But these were different from the tears of shame from earlier. His father's hand squeezed his shoulder gently. Jack knelt down again beside Elliot's chair. "How about we go get you something to eat, buddy?" he asked softly. "Whatever you want." As Elliot nodded and gathered his empty lunchbox, Jack became aware of the looks being exchanged among the teachers and staff. Their expressions ranged from concern to outright disapproval. One teacher whispered something to another, shaking her head slowly. The school counselor, who had appeared in the doorway, was already pulling out her phone, no doubt to make some calls. The cafeteria monitor near the garbage bins took a small step backward, when Jack glanced in her direction. Jack recognized these looks. He'd seen them countless times before. The judgment, the fear, the quick assumptions made based on his appearance and his patch. But now these looks weren't just directed at him. They were falling on Elliot too, and that made his jaw tighten. Still, he kept his expression neutral as he stood up with Elliot. His son needed to see strength now, not anger. He placed his hand protectively on Elliot's back as they began walking toward the cafeteria doors, the sea of students parting before them like water. Chapter 5. A New Beginning. Chapter 4. Shocking Revelations. Scene 2. Elliot walked beside his father through the empty school hallway, their footsteps echoing against the pale green walls lined with student artwork. His heart was still racing from everything that had happened in the cafeteria. Looking up at Jack's towering figure, Elliot felt a mix of emotions he'd never experienced before. Pride swelled in his chest at how his father had stood up to Mrs. Green. No one had ever done that before. But there was also a knot in his stomach when he remembered the way the teachers had looked at them, their whispers following them out of the cafeteria like shadows. Jack guided them to a quiet corner near the school's main entrance, where sunlight streamed through large windows. He sat down on one of the wooden benches and patted the space next to him. Elliot climbed up, his feet dangling above the floor. "You okay, buddy?" Jack's voice was gentle, different from the firm tone he'd used with Mrs. Green. Elliot nodded, then shook his head, then shrugged. "I don't know," he admitted, staring at his hands in his lap. "I'm happy you're here, but..." His voice trailed off. "But you're worried about what others think?" Jack finished for him. When Elliot nodded, Jack let out a deep breath. "Listen, son. People are always going to have something to say. About you, about me, about anyone who's different from what they expect." "Like your tattoos?" Elliot asked, tracing one of the intricate designs on his father's arm with his finger. Jack smiled. "Yeah, like my tattoos, and my jacket, and my past." He turned to face Elliot fully. "But here's what matters. We're family. And family stands up for each other no matter what. That's a promise." The knot in Elliot's stomach began to loosen. "Even when people say mean things?" "Especially then," Jack assured him. "You see, being brave isn't about not feeling scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared." Elliot thought about this for a moment. "Like when you stood up to Mrs. Green?" "Like when I stood up to Mrs. Green," Jack confirmed with a nod. "And you know what? I was a little nervous too. But you're my son, and nothing's more important than protecting you." A warm feeling spread through Elliot's chest, replacing the earlier uncertainty. He leaned against his father's side, feeling the rough leather of the jacket against his cheek. Jack's arm came around his shoulders, strong and secure. The afternoon bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Students began filling the hallways, their chatter growing louder. Some stared as they passed by, but under his father's protective arm, Elliot found he didn't mind as much anymore. As they stood up to leave, Jack adjusted Elliot's backpack straps with careful hands. "Remember something important, buddy," he said as they walked toward the school doors together. "All those looks, all those whispers, they don't matter. What matters is right here." He tapped Elliot's chest, right over his heart. "Family. Love. That's what's real. That's what counts." Elliot grabbed his father's hand as they stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun. For the first time since the cafeteria incident, he felt truly safe. The way people looked at them still bothered him a little, but his father's words echoed in his mind. Family stands up for each other, no matter what. The morning sun cast long shadows through the school windows as Elliot walked down the hallway to his classroom. Something felt different today. The usual morning chatter seemed hushed and heads turned as he passed by. His classmates' eyes followed him, then quickly darted away when he looked back. Tommy Jensen, who usually said hi to Elliot every morning, suddenly became very interested in the contents of his locker. Sarah Miller, his reading partner, switched seats when he sat down for first period, leaving him alone at his desk. Near the water fountain, he heard two fourth graders talking in low voices. "My mom says his dad was in prison," one whispered. "She says he was in a gang and did really bad things." "I heard he hurt people," the other replied, their words hitting Elliot like tiny daggers. Down the administrative hallway, Mrs. Green's voice carried through her partially open office door. "It's completely inappropriate," she was saying to someone. "A man like that, with his history, shouldn't be allowed anywhere near school grounds. Think of the children's safety." "But he seems different now," another teacher responded uncertainly. "People like that don't change," Mrs. Green insisted, her voice sharp with conviction. "Once a criminal, always a criminal. Mark my words." Elliot's throat felt tight as he hurried past the office. His father's words from yesterday about being brave seemed harder to hold on to now. The morning dragged on, each class feeling longer than the last. When lunchtime came, Elliot's usual table was suddenly full, even though there were clearly empty seats. He stood there with his tray, watching as kids who used to sit with him found excuses to move away. The cafeteria felt enormous and cold, despite the warm spring day outside. Finding an empty table in the corner, Elliot sat down alone. He could feel Mrs. Green watching him from her supervisor's post, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and disapproval. The sandwich in front of him lost all appeal as he heard more whispers floating around him. "Did you see his dad yesterday? Those tattoos looked scary. My parents said I can't play with him anymore." A group of girls from his class walked past, giving him a wide berth as if he carried something contagious. One of them, Katie, who had shared her cookies with him just last week, now clutched her lunch tray tighter and quickened her pace. The isolation felt heavy, like a thick blanket that made it hard to breathe. Elliot poked at his food, remembering how just yesterday, this same room had been the place where his father had stood up for him. Now it felt like a different world entirely. During afternoon recess, the playground became a maze of avoidance. When he approached the swings, other kids suddenly remembered they needed to be somewhere else. The basketball game he usually joined came to an abrupt halt, the players claiming they were finished just as he walked up. Standing alone by the fence, watching his former friends play without him, Elliot felt the full weight of being different. The proud feeling he'd had yesterday when his father defended him was still there, but now it competed with a growing sense of loneliness that seemed to expand with each passing hour. The whispers followed him like shadows, growing longer and darker as the day wore on, until they seemed to fill every corner of the school with their judgment and fear. Principal Jensen looked up from her desk as Jack Sullivan entered her office. Despite his intimidating appearance, she noticed how carefully he closed the door and how politely he removed his leather cap. His huge frame made the visitor's chair seem tiny as he sat down. "Thank you for meeting with me, Principal Jensen," Jack said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "I know there's been some concern about my presence at the school." The principal adjusted her glasses, trying not to stare at the tattoos visible beneath his shirt sleeves. "Yes. Well, several parents have expressed their worries, Mr. Sullivan. I understand that." Jack leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "I'm not the same man I was years ago. I served my country as a Marine before I lost my way. But now I'm just trying to be there for my son." Principal Jensen watched as Jack pulled out some papers from his jacket. "These are my discharge papers from the Marines," he explained, "and documentation of my community service work. I volunteer at the Veterans Center every weekend, helping other vets get back on their feet." She carefully examined the papers, noting the excellent recommendations. "This is impressive, Mr. Sullivan. I know my appearance makes people uncomfortable," Jack continued, gesturing to his tattoos. "But I can't erase my past. I can only prove who I am now, day by day." The principal nodded slowly, remembering Elliot's typically good behavior and kind nature. "Your son is a wonderful student, Mr. Sullivan. He's never given us any trouble." "That's because his mother did an amazing job raising him while I was away." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "I missed so much of his life. I can't change that, but I can be here for him now." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Green entered, her face tightening when she saw Jack. Principal Jensen noticed how Jack remained calm, even offering a polite nod to the woman who had humiliated his son. After school, Jack waited for Elliot by his motorcycle. Some parents hurried their children past him, but he remained steady, focused only on his son's approaching figure. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, pulling Elliot into a warm hug. "How about we take a ride?" They drove to a quiet spot by the lake, where Jack had packed a simple picnic. As they sat on a bench, watching the water, Jack noticed his son's troubled expression. "The kids at school," Elliot began. "They won't talk to me anymore." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You know, when I first came home from the Marines, some people treated me the same way. They saw my tattoos and made up their minds about who I was." "What did you do?" Elliot asked, picking at his sandwich. "I remembered something my drill sergeant told me. Your character isn't what others say about you. It's what you do when no one's watching." Jack smiled at his son. "Every day, I try to be a better man than I was yesterday. That's all any of us can do." Elliot looked up at his father, seeing beyond the tough exterior to the wisdom in his words. "But it's hard when everyone thinks they know who you are." "The people who matter will take the time to see the real you," Jack said, putting his arm around Elliot's shoulders. "Just like you see the real me, son. That's what counts." As the afternoon light sparkled on the lake, Elliot felt stronger despite the challenges ahead. His father's presence, once a source of confusion, now felt like a shield against the world's judgment. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the community center's parking lot as Jack Sullivan pulled up on his motorcycle. He wore a plain white t-shirt instead of his usual leather jacket, his tattoos visible but somehow less intimidating in the soft morning light. Elliot sat behind him, arms wrapped around his father's waist. "You don't have to stay, buddy," Jack said, helping his son off the bike. "I know Saturday mornings are for cartoons." Elliot shook his head, his blonde hair catching the sunlight. "I want to help too, Dad." Inside the community center, volunteers were setting up for the weekly food bank. Jack checked in at the registration desk, where the elderly volunteer flinched slightly at his appearance, but managed a polite smile. Elliot noticed and gripped his father's hand tighter. "Where do you need us?" Jack asked, his voice gentle despite his imposing presence. "The heavy lifting is in the back," the volunteer said, pointing toward the storage room. "We need those boxes of canned goods brought out front." Jack nodded and headed to the back, Elliot trailing behind him. As they worked, Elliot watched his father carefully. Jack moved with purpose, organizing boxes efficiently, helping elderly volunteers reach high shelves, and offering quiet assistance wherever needed. But Elliot also saw the sideways glances, the whispered conversations, and the way some people gave his father a wide berth. "Here, let me help with that," Jack said to an older woman struggling with a heavy box. She hesitated for a moment, eyeing his tattoos, but then allowed him to take the box. Her tension eased when she saw his careful handling of the supplies. Throughout the morning, Elliot felt a mix of emotions churning in his stomach. Pride swelled in his chest when he saw his father's kindness, but fear gripped him whenever he noticed the judgmental stares. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them they were wrong about his dad. But he stayed quiet, following Jack's example of quiet dignity. Later that afternoon, they helped set up for the town's monthly community fair in the park. Jack volunteered to handle the heavy setup work, assembling tents and arranging tables. Some of the other volunteers worked alongside him, but many kept their distance. "Sullivan," called Mr. Peterson, the fair coordinator, "we need those speakers set up by the main stage." Jack nodded and headed towards the equipment. Elliot noticed how Mr. Peterson didn't quite meet his father's eyes, how he spoke to Jack only when necessary. Still, Jack worked steadily, his movements careful and deliberate. "Dad," Elliot whispered as they carried chairs together, "why do they still act like this? You're helping so much." Jack set down his stack of chairs and knelt beside his son. "Sometimes, buddy, people need time to see the truth. All we can do is keep showing up and doing what's right." As the fair began, families started arriving. Some parents pulled their children closer when they passed Jack, while others pretended not to see him at all. The cold shoulders and suspicious glances continued, but Jack kept working, setting up game booths and helping wherever he could. Elliot watched his father accept a cup of water from one of the volunteers, noting how Jack's "thank you" was met with silence. But his father's expression never changed. He remained patient, helpful, and determined, even as the wall of judgment stood firm around him. Still, Jack continued his work, moving through the crowd with quiet purpose, his actions speaking louder than any words could. Elliot saw both strength and hurt in his father's eyes. But most of all, he saw unwavering resolve. The playground buzzed with activity during recess. Kids swung from monkey bars and chased each other across the blacktop, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Elliot sat alone on a wooden bench near the fence, watching the other children play. His peanut butter sandwich remained untouched in his lap. He hadn't felt much like eating lately. Tommy Martinez, one of the bigger boys in his class, nudged his friends and pointed in Elliot's direction. "Hey guys, watch this," he said loud enough for Elliot to hear. The group of boys sauntered over, their sneakers scraping against the concrete. "What's wrong, Sullivan?" Tommy called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "No daddy to protect you today?" Elliot's shoulders tensed, but he kept his eyes fixed on his sandwich, trying to make himself as small as possible. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Stay strong, buddy. Their words can't hurt you unless you let them." "My mom says your dad's a criminal," another boy chimed in. "Says he probably robbed banks and stuff." "Bet he killed people too," added a third boy, making gun gestures with his fingers. "Bang, bang." The sandwich in Elliot's hands began to crumble as his grip tightened. He could feel his face growing hot, but he refused to look up. A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. "Criminal's kid," Tommy sang, dancing around the bench. "Criminal's kid. Better watch out. He might steal your lunch money." Elliot's throat felt tight. He wanted to tell them they were wrong, that his dad was a good person who volunteered at the food bank and helped old ladies with their groceries. But the words wouldn't come. "I heard he was in jail," someone whispered loudly. "My dad says people like that never change," another voice added. The bell rang, signaling the end of recess. Elliot's untouched sandwich went into the trash as he trudged back to class, the boys' taunts still ringing in his ears. He walked slowly, deliberately taking the longest route to avoid running into anyone else. By the time he reached Mrs. Green's classroom, most of the other students were already seated. The clock on the wall showed he was 3 minutes late. Green stood at her desk, her wire-rimmed glasses perched on the tip of her nose, her gray hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice sharp as a knife. "Late again, I see." Elliot mumbled an apology and started toward his desk, but Mrs. Green wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The other students watched in silence, some smirking, others looking away uncomfortably. As Elliot passed her desk, Mrs. Green leaned down. Her perfume was overwhelming, something floral and suffocating. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet classroom, her words seemed to echo off the walls. People like you don't belong here. 5 simple words, but they hit Elliot like a physical blow. His stomach clenched, and the lump in his throat grew bigger. He slid into his seat, trying to ignore the snickers from his classmates, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. The math problems on the board blurred before his eyes as Mrs. Green began the lesson. Elliot stared at his desk, his father's leather jacket and proud smile seeming very far away now. For the first time since his dad had stood up for him in the cafeteria, he felt completely and utterly alone. That evening, Elliot pushed his dinner around his plate, the mashed potatoes growing cold. Jack watched his son from across their small kitchen table, noting the slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. The usually chatty 8-year-old hadn't said more than 2 words since coming home from school. "Something on your mind, buddy?" Jack's deep voice was gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing appearance. Elliot shrugged, still not meeting his father's eyes. "Just tired." Jack set down his fork and leaned forward. "You know, when I was in the Marines, we had a saying, 'A burden shared is a burden halved.'" Finally, Elliot looked up. His blue eyes were rimmed with red. "The kids at school, they said mean things about you, about us." His voice cracked slightly. "And Mrs. Green, she said we don't belong here." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Come here, son." He pushed back his chair and patted his knee. Elliot circled the table and climbed onto his father's lap, something he hadn't done since Jack had returned. Despite his tough exterior, Jack's embrace was warm and secure. "Listen to me carefully, Elliot," Jack began, his rough hands gentle as they squeezed his son's shoulders. "People are going to say all sorts of things about us. Some of them might be true. I've made mistakes in my past. But that doesn't mean we don't deserve happiness now." "But why can't they see you're different?" Elliot's voice was small but filled with frustration. "Because change takes time to prove," Jack explained. "Remember when you were learning to ride a bike? You didn't get it right away, did you?" Elliot shook his head. "But you kept trying, and eventually people saw that you could ride just as well as anyone else. That's what we're going to do. Keep trying, keep showing up, keep being the best versions of ourselves we can be. Even when they're mean to us? Especially then." Jack's voice grew firm. "We're not going to let other people control our happiness, buddy. That's our job. And you know what else?" "What?" "Everyone deserves a second chance. That's something I learned the hard way. We're going to earn their trust, you and me together. It might take time, but we're Sullivans. We don't give up." A small smile tugged at the corner of Elliot's mouth. "Like when you taught me to make scrambled eggs, and I kept burning them?" Jack chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. "Exactly like that. But you kept trying, and now you make the best scrambled eggs in town." "Can we make some now?" Elliot asked, his eyes brightening for the first time that evening. "You bet we can." Jack stood up, keeping Elliot in his arms for a moment longer. "And while we cook, we can plan ways to show this town what the Sullivans are really made of. What do you say?" Elliot wrapped his arms around his father's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and aftershave. "I say yes. And Dad?" "Yeah, buddy? I'm glad you're here now." Jack's eyes grew misty as he set his son down. Together they moved to the counter, pulling out eggs and a mixing bowl. As they began to cook, they talked about small ways they could make a difference. Helping at the local food bank, volunteering at the animal shelter, maybe even starting a father-son reading program at the library. For the first time since the bullying began, Elliot felt hope blooming in his chest. His father's words had taken root, and he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could change things together. The morning sun filtered through the gymnasium windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Elliot sat in the back row of the metal folding chairs, his stomach tied in knots. Around him, students chatted and fidgeted, waiting for the assembly to begin. The familiar squeak of sneakers and rustling of clothes did nothing to calm his nerves. Principal Jensen stood at the podium, shuffling papers and adjusting the microphone. Near the front, Mrs. Green sat with perfect posture, her gray hair pulled back in its usual tight bun. She whispered something to another teacher, both of them glancing back at Elliot with disapproving looks. "I wish Dad was here," Elliot mumbled to himself, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He thought about their breakfast that morning, how Jack had made him toast with extra butter and told him to hold his head high no matter what. But sitting here now, surrounded by judgmental stares, holding his head high felt impossible. The assembly was supposed to be about community expectations. At least that's what the notice sent home had said. But Elliot knew better. He'd overheard Mrs. Green talking to Principal Jensen yesterday about addressing certain concerns about the school's reputation. Tommy Martinez, who sat 2 seats away, kept sneaking glances at Elliot. Last week, they'd been partners in science class, but today Tommy acted like Elliot didn't exist. It hurt more than Elliot wanted to admit. "Good morning, students and faculty." Principal Jensen's voice crackled through the speakers. The gymnasium fell quiet. "Today we're here to discuss our community values and expectations." Elliot's hands grew sweaty as he listened. Principal Jensen talked about respect, responsibility, and representing the school well. She mentioned how important it was for families to uphold these values. With each word, Elliot felt smaller and smaller. Mrs. Green raised her hand during the question period. Principal Jensen nodded, giving her permission to speak. Mrs. Green stood, smoothing her skirt as she did so. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room," she said, her voice carrying across the gymnasium. "Some families in our community may not understand the standards we expect. Perhaps they're more accustomed to different environments." A few teachers nodded in agreement. Elliot's face burned as he felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. His chest tightened, and he gripped the edges of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "For instance," Mrs. Green continued, her lips curling into a slight smile, "we've recently had some concerning influences around our children. The Sullivan family, for example." The words hit Elliot like a physical blow. He thought about his father, how hard Jack worked to prove himself, how gentle he was despite his tough appearance, how he read bedtime stories to Elliot every night. He remembered Jack's words from their talk in the kitchen. "We're not going to let other people control our happiness." Something shifted inside Elliot. The fear and shame that had been weighing him down transformed into something else: determination. Before he knew what he was doing, he was on his feet, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice shaky but clear enough to carry through the quiet gymnasium. Every head turned toward him. Principal Jensen paused, microphone in hand, looking surprised. Mrs. Green's smile faltered. Elliot took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of courage he could find. This was his moment to speak up, to defend his family, to show everyone that the Sullivans deserved respect just like anyone else. Elliot's heart thundered in his chest as he stood, legs shaking beneath him. The gymnasium seemed impossibly large now, with hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Through the crowd, he caught sight of his father standing at the back of the room, having slipped in quietly during the assembly. Jack gave him a subtle nod, and somehow that small gesture made Elliot stand a little straighter. I need to say something, Elliot said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. Mrs. Green, you're wrong about my family. A collective gasp rippled through the gymnasium. Mrs. Green's eyebrows shot up, and she opened her mouth to speak, but Principal Jensen held up a hand, allowing Elliot to continue. My dad isn't perfect, Elliot said, his voice growing stronger with each word. But he loves me more than anything. He reads to me every night. He makes me breakfast every morning. He helps me with my homework, even when it's really hard. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but Elliot blinked them away. He thought about all the times Jack had shown up for him. The parent-teacher conferences, the little notes in his lunchbox, the way he always listened when Elliot needed to talk. You keep talking about his past, Elliot continued, looking directly at Mrs. Green now. But you don't know anything about who he is now. My dad volunteers at the food bank. He helps old Mrs. Wilson with her yard work. He's teaching me that it's not what people say about you that matters. It's what you do that counts. Tommy Martinez, who had been avoiding Elliot all week, sat up straighter in his chair. A few other students nodded, their expressions thoughtful. My dad isn't defined by his past, Elliot said, his voice steady and clear. He's defined by how much he loves me and how hard he works to be better every day. That's all that matters. The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. Even the usual creaking of the old heating system seemed muted. Green's face had lost its usual smugness, replaced by an expression of uncertainty. She shifted in her seat, straightening her already perfect collar. From the back of the room, Jack stood tall and proud, his eyes glistening with emotion. A few parents who had come for the assembly turned to look at him, their faces softer than before. Principal Jensen stepped forward, adjusting her glasses. The microphone squeaked as she moved it, the sound echoing through the quiet room. But before she could speak, something unexpected happened. Tommy raised his hand slowly, then stood up. Elliot's right, he said. His dad helped my little sister when she fell off her bike last week. He was really nice. Another student nodded, then another. Small murmurs of agreement began to spread through the crowd. Elliot felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched some of his classmates exchange knowing looks and supportive smiles. Mrs. Green's face had turned an interesting shade of pink. She sat down rather abruptly, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. The air in the gymnasium still felt tense, like a rubber band stretched almost to its breaking point. But something had shifted. In the faces of his classmates, Elliot saw the first glimmers of understanding, maybe even acceptance. Standing there, with his father's proud gaze on his back and his classmates' support beginning to emerge, Elliot felt a small surge of hope bloom in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. The hallway outside the principal's office felt colder than usual. Elliot sat on the hard wooden bench, his feet barely touching the floor, watching the clock tick away above the water fountain. His stomach twisted into knots as he heard muffled voices coming from inside the office. Earlier that morning, during math class, Mrs. Jensen had quietly called him out of the room. His first thought was that he was in trouble, but the look on her face wasn't angry. It was concerned. That's when she told him a social worker had come to talk to him. "Just answer her questions honestly, Elliot," Mrs. Jensen had said, squeezing his shoulder gently. "Everything will be okay." Now, waiting outside the office, Elliot couldn't stop his leg from bouncing up and down. The social worker, Ms. Martinez, sat next to him, writing something in her notepad. She seemed nice enough. She had kind eyes and a soft voice. But Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that everything he and his dad had built could come crashing down. "So, Elliot," Ms. Martinez said, looking up from her notes, "tell me about your daily routine with your father." Elliot took a deep breath, remembering his dad's words about always telling the truth. Dad wakes me up at 7 every morning. He makes breakfast, usually eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes on weekends. He checks my homework before we leave for school. Miss Martinez nodded, jotting down notes. And after school? He picks me up most days, unless he has to work late at the garage. Then Mrs. Wilson from next door watches me until he gets home. We do homework together, and he makes dinner. Elliot's voice grew stronger as he talked about their life together. Sometimes we play catch in the backyard, or he teaches me about fixing cars. I see, Ms. Martinez said. And how do you feel when you're with your father? Elliot didn't hesitate. Safe, happy. He fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. Dad says we're a team. The social worker's pen paused on her paper. Some people are concerned about your father's past associations. Has he ever made you feel scared or uncomfortable? Never, Elliot said firmly, thinking about all the times his father had comforted him after nightmares or protected him from bullies. Dad's the bravest person I know, and he's always gentle with me. Before Ms. Martinez could ask another question, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jack appeared, still wearing his work clothes from the garage, a worried look on his face. When he saw Elliot, his expression softened. Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Martinez stood up, extending her hand. I'm Clara Martinez from Child Protective Services. We received an anonymous report about your situation with Elliot. Jack shook her hand, his large frame seeming to fill the narrow hallway. I understand, he said quietly. Would you like to talk in private? Ms. Martinez nodded, and Jack knelt down in front of Elliot. Hey, buddy, everything's going to be fine. Why don't you wait here while I talk to Ms. Martinez? Elliot watched as they disappeared into the principal's office, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Through the frosted glass, he could see their silhouettes, his father's broad shoulders, Ms. Martinez's smaller frame as she sat down at the desk. The muffled sound of his father's voice drifted through the door. Though Elliot couldn't make out the words, he recognized the tone. It was the same honest, determined voice Jack used when teaching him important life lessons. Still, as the minutes ticked by, Elliot couldn't help but worry about what would happen next. The days after Ms. Martinez's visit felt different. While they waited for her decision, Jack spent even more time with Elliot than usual. On Saturday morning, they worked together in the garage where Jack taught auto repair. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal filled the air as Jack showed Elliot how to change a tire. See this lug wrench? Jack held up the cross-shaped tool. Sometimes the nuts are really tight, and it takes all your strength to loosen them. He positioned the wrench on a wheel nut and demonstrated. But you know what? Even if it seems impossible at first, you keep trying. That's what matters. Elliot watched his father's strong hands work the wrench. Like how you're trying to show everyone you've changed? Jack paused, a proud smile crossing his face. Exactly like that, buddy. Some people might take longer to see the truth, but we don't give up. They worked side by side, Jack teaching Elliot about different tools and car parts. When Elliot struggled with a particularly stubborn bolt, Jack didn't jump in to help right away. Instead, he encouraged him to keep trying, showing him how to adjust his grip and stance. There you go, Jack beamed when Elliot finally loosened the bolt. See what happens when you persist? During lunch breaks, they sat on old wooden stools, sharing sandwiches and stories. Jack told Elliot about his time in the Marines, about the discipline and brotherhood he learned there. He spoke about mistakes he'd made after leaving the service, but also about his journey to become a better person. Everyone has a past, son, Jack said, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. What matters is what we do with our present. One afternoon, while they were organizing tools, Ms. Martinez appeared at the garage entrance. Her clipboard was tucked under her arm, and her expression was neutral. Jack immediately stood straighter, placing a protective hand on Elliot's shoulder. Mr. Sullivan, she began, her voice professional but kind. I've completed my investigation. Elliot felt his father's hand tighten slightly on his shoulder. The garage seemed suddenly quiet, even the usual hum of the fluorescent lights fading into the background. After thorough consideration and multiple interviews, I found no cause for concern regarding Elliot's welfare. Ms. Martinez's face softened into a smile. In fact, I've been impressed by the stable, nurturing environment you've created for your son. Jack's whole body seemed to relax, though he maintained his composure. Thank you, Ms. Martinez. The case is closed, she continued, though I should mention that some community members still express concerns. She glanced meaningfully at a couple walking past the garage, who quickly averted their eyes when they saw Jack. But that's not within my jurisdiction. My job is to ensure Elliot is safe and well cared for, which he clearly is. Elliot hugged his father's side, feeling the tension drain from Jack's body. Ms. Martinez gave them both a warm nod before leaving, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. Through the open garage door, they could see people passing by, some still casting suspicious glances their way. But for the first time since the investigation began, Elliot didn't feel scared. He looked up at his father, who stood tall and steady despite the lingering judgment in people's eyes. Hey, Dad, Elliot said, picking up a wrench. Can you show me how to fix that carburetor now? Jack's face broke into a broad smile. Sure thing, buddy. Let's get to work. The playground buzzed with activity during recess. Kids swung on monkey bars, chased each other across the blacktop, and played hopscotch near the basketball courts. But Elliot Sullivan stood alone near the fence, watching the other children play. His heart pounded as he spotted Tommy, Derek, and Marcus heading his way, the same boys who'd been making his life difficult since his dad showed up at school. Well, if it isn't the criminal's kid, Tommy sneered, his spiky brown hair catching the sunlight. He was the tallest of the three, and always seemed to be the one starting trouble. Derek and Marcus snickered behind him, like they always did. They formed a half circle around Elliot, blocking his path to the playground equipment. Elliot felt his face grow hot. His dad's words from their time in the garage echoed in his mind. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and looked Tommy straight in the eye. My dad's not a criminal, Elliot said, his voice stronger than he expected. He's a hero. Tommy's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Usually, Elliot just walked away or stared at his shoes when they teased him. A hero, Derek laughed. Everyone knows he was in jail. My mom told me. Elliot's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he remembered his father's advice about staying calm. You don't know the whole story, he said firmly. My dad served in the Marines. He protected our country. So what? Tommy shot back. He still got into trouble after that. My dad says once a criminal, always a criminal. Elliot took a step forward, surprising himself with his own courage. That's not true. People can change. My dad works harder than anyone I know. He fixes cars, helps people, and... Elliot's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. And he's the best father anyone could ask for. A small crowd of students had gathered around them now, watching the confrontation with curious eyes. Elliot noticed Sarah from his math class among them, looking at him with something that might have been respect. He teaches me about cars, Elliot continued, his confidence growing. He helps old Mrs. Johnson with her grocery shopping every week. He volunteers at the community center. What do your dads do besides judge people they don't even know? Tommy's face reddened. He clearly hadn't expected this kind of resistance. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features. Marcus stepped forward, trying to save face for their group. Oh yeah? Well, at least our dads don't look like scary bikers. At least they're He struggled with the word. Normal! A few kids in the crowd giggled, but it sounded forced and uncomfortable. Elliot felt that familiar sting of shame trying to creep back in, but this time, he pushed it away. Normal is boring, Elliot said quietly, but clearly. He thought about his dad's tattoos, each one telling a story of his life. He thought about the leather jacket that kept him warm on their motorcycle rides to get ice cream. He thought about the strong hands that taught him to fix engines, and the gentle voice that told him bedtime stories. Without another word, Elliot turned and walked away. He didn't run or hurry. He walked tall and steady, just like his father would. He could feel their eyes on his back, but for the first time, he didn't care what they thought. His dad had taught him that actions speak louder than words, and right now, his actions were saying everything that needed to be said. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed into the cramped meeting room. Metal folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor while concerned citizens took their seats, many casting wary glances at Jack Sullivan, who sat quietly in the back row. His massive frame seemed out of place in the tiny chair, but his expression remained calm and steady. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Tonight's town hall meeting will address recent concerns about our community's values and the meaning of second chances. His eyes flickered briefly to Jack. We'll hear from various community members, and then open the floor for discussion. Mrs. Green sat in the front row, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Next to her, several parents from the PTA whispered among themselves, occasionally turning to look at Jack. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. After several speakers voiced their concerns about maintaining community standards and protecting our children, Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. Mr. Sullivan, would you like to address the gathering? Jack stood slowly, his chair creaking as he rose. His leather jacket was gone, replaced by a clean white button-down shirt. The tattoos on his arms were still visible, but somehow they seemed less threatening now. He made his way to the podium, each heavy step echoing in the sudden silence. I'm not good at fancy speeches, Jack began, his deep voice steady but gentle. But I am good at telling the truth, and the truth is, I've made mistakes. Big ones. He paused, his hands gripping the podium. I've spent years trying to make up for those mistakes, not just for myself, but for my son, Elliot. The room stayed silent, all eyes fixed on the big man whose voice carried such unexpected tenderness. Every morning, I wake up and choose to be better than I was yesterday. I fix cars at my shop, help my neighbors when they need it, and try to teach my son what it means to be a good man. Jack's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gazes of those who would look at him. I'm not asking you to forget my past. I'm asking you to see who I am now. He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket and held it up. It showed him and Elliot working on an old Chevy, both covered in grease but grinning widely. This is who I am. A father who wants to give his son a better life than I had. A neighbor who wants to contribute to his community. A man who believes in redemption because he's lived it. Several people shifted in their seats, some nodding slowly. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman Jack helped with groceries, raised her hand timidly. I'd like to say something, she said, her voice quavering but determined. Mr. Sullivan carries my groceries every week, refuses to take a penny for it, and even fixed my porch steps for free. That's not the action of a bad man. Jack's eyes moistened slightly, but he maintained his composure. I can't change the past, he continued, but I can work every day to be worthy of your trust, to be the kind of father my son deserves, and to be the kind of neighbor this town needs. As Jack returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Where there had been rigid hostility, now there was thoughtful consideration. Even Mrs. Green's stern expression had softened slightly. Not everyone was convinced, but the seeds of acceptance had been planted. Mayor Thompson returned to the podium, looking around the room with newfound appreciation. The discussion that followed was more measured, more open to the possibility that people could change, that second chances weren't just empty words, but real opportunities for transformation. Elliot walked down the quiet hallway during recess, heading to return a library book. The familiar smell of chalk dust and floor cleaner filled the air as his sneakers squeaked against the freshly polished floor. Everything seemed normal until he heard voices coming from Principal Jensen's office. "This is serious, Margaret," a voice whispered urgently. Elliot recognized it as Mrs. Carter, the fourth-grade teacher. The letter specifically threatens to expose everything about Jack Sullivan's past to the local newspaper. Elliot's heart stopped. He froze next to the partially open door, clutching his library book tightly against his chest. I know, Principal Jensen sighed. But threatening letters? This is going too far. Jack has been nothing but cooperative since he came back to town. But his history with the hellsangels... Mrs. Carter's voice trailed off. The letter mentions some pretty awful things, if even half of it is true. The man has paid his dues, Principal Jensen said firmly. He's trying to build a life with his son. This kind of harassment isn't right. Elliot's hands trembled as he held the book. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he fought them back. The sound of footsteps approaching the door made him jump. He quickly ducked around the corner, his heart pounding. That afternoon, Elliot couldn't focus on his schoolwork. The words in his textbook blurred together as his mind kept going back to the conversation he'd overheard. When the final bell rang, he walked slowly to his father's truck in the parking lot. Jack was waiting, as always, leaning against the hood of his black pickup. His smile faded when he saw Elliot's troubled face. "What's wrong, buddy?" Elliot climbed into the passenger seat, waiting until his father got in before speaking. "Dad," he said quietly, "someone sent a letter to school about you." Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice remained calm. "What kind of letter?" "They want you to leave town," Elliot's voice cracked. "They're going to tell everyone about your past if you don't go." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned off the engine and turned to face his son. "Elliot, look at me." Elliot raised his eyes to meet his father's steady gaze. "There are going to be people who want us to run away," Jack said softly. "People who think they can scare us with threats and old stories. But running away doesn't solve anything. It just proves them right." "But what if the stories are bad?" Elliot asked, his voice small. Jack took a deep breath. "Some of them probably are. I made mistakes, son. Big ones. But I'm not that person anymore. And I won't let anyone force us out of our home because of who I used to be." "Are you scared?" Elliot asked. "Sometimes," Jack admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you face your fears anyway. And we'll face this together, okay?" Elliot nodded slowly, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift a little. "Together," he repeated. That's right," Jack smiled, reaching over to ruffle Elliot's hair. "Whatever comes our way, we'll handle it as a team. No running, no hiding, just you and me facing it head on." For the first time since hearing about the letter, Elliot felt a spark of hope. His dad wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. They would stand their ground together. Elliot sat on the front porch steps of their small house, his legs bouncing nervously as he watched cars drive past. Every time a vehicle slowed near their driveway, his heart jumped, thinking it might be Ms. Thompson, the social worker, with her final report. The morning sun warmed his face, but he couldn't shake the chill of worry that had settled in his bones. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear his father moving around in the kitchen, trying to keep busy while they waited. "Want some breakfast, buddy?" Jack called from inside. I'm not hungry, Elliot replied, his stomach too knotted to think about food. The screen door creaked open, and Jack's heavy boots thudded on the wooden porch. He sat down next to Elliot, careful not to crowd him. You know, watching for the mail won't make it come any faster. Elliot picked at a loose thread on his jeans. What if the report is bad? Then we'll deal with it, Jack said simply. He reached over and put his large hand on Elliot's shoulder. Whatever happens, we face it together, remember? A familiar blue car turned onto their street, and Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It was Ms. Thompson's sedan. He stood up quickly, his legs shaky beneath him. The car pulled into their driveway, and Ms. Thompson stepped out, holding a manila envelope. Her face was neutral, giving nothing away as she approached them. Good morning, Mr. Sullivan, Elliot, she said professionally. I have my final report here. Jack stood up, nodding respectfully. Would you like to come inside? That won't be necessary, Ms. Thompson replied, and Elliot's heart sank. But then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. I just wanted to deliver this personally and tell you both how impressed I've been. She opened the envelope and pulled out several papers. Mr. Sullivan, your dedication to your son is evident in everything you do. The way you've turned your life around, your involvement in the community, and most importantly, the stable and loving environment you've created for Elliot. It's all documented here. Elliot felt tears of relief prick at his eyes. He looked up at his father, who stood straight and tall, but Elliot could see his hands trembling slightly. The report confirms what I've observed, Ms. Thompson continued. You're a capable and loving father. Elliot is thriving under your care, despite the challenges you've both faced from the community. She handed the report to Jack, who took it carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've already filed my recommendations with the court and the school board, Ms. Thompson added. They'll receive copies today. I hope this helps put some of the concerns to rest. As she turned to leave, she paused and looked back at them. You know, Mr. Sullivan, sometimes the best parents are the ones who've learned from their mistakes. Keep doing what you're doing. After she drove away, Elliot and Jack sat back down on the porch steps, the report between them. Jack opened it slowly, and they read through it together. Words like exemplary effort and positive environment jumped out from the pages. Through the window of the house across the street, Elliot noticed Mrs. Peterson, who had always been one of their harshest critics, watching them. But instead of turning away when she was spotted, she gave a small, hesitant wave. Dad? Elliot said softly. Yeah, buddy. I think things are going to be okay now. Jack pulled Elliot close, and they sat together in the morning sun, the weight of worry finally lifting from their shoulders. The morning bell rang through the hallways of Cedar Grove Elementary as Elliot walked to his classroom. Something felt different today. Maybe it was because of the social worker's report, or maybe word had gotten around about how his dad was changing things in town. But the usual morning whispers seemed quieter. Tommy Martinez, who usually kept his distance, gave Elliot a small nod as he passed by. Sarah Chen, one of the smartest kids in class, actually smiled at him when he sat down at his desk next to hers. Hey, Elliot, she whispered, as Mrs. Watson started writing on the blackboard. Did you understand the math homework from yesterday? Elliot blinked in surprise. This was the first time in weeks that someone had talked to him about something as normal as homework. Yeah, I think so, he whispered back. Do you need help? Sarah nodded, and they spent the next few minutes quietly comparing answers while Mrs. Watson's back was turned. It felt so normal, like how things used to be before everyone found out about his dad. During recess, instead of hiding near the library like he usually did, Elliot ventured out to the playground. He stood at the edge of the basketball court, watching the other kids play. Marcus, a boy who had once called him Criminal Junior, caught the ball and, to Elliot's surprise, tossed it his way. "Want to play?" Marcus asked, his voice uncertain but friendly. Elliot caught the ball, his hands trembling slightly. "Really?" "Yeah. We need one more person for even teams," Marcus said, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal, but Elliot could see the apology in his eyes. The game wasn't anything special. Elliot missed more shots than he made. But nobody teased him about it. They just played, laughed, and acted like regular kids. Even when he accidentally passed the ball to the wrong team, the other players just groaned good-naturedly instead of using it as an excuse to mock him. Back in class, Elliot noticed more changes. During group work, people actually wanted to partner with him. At lunch, a few kids even sat at his table, talking about normal things like video games and TV shows. Nobody mentioned his dad or brought up the past. As the final bell rang and students started packing up their bags, Marcus approached Elliot's desk, holding a stack of bright blue envelopes. He shuffled his feet nervously, then held one out to Elliot. "So, I'm having a birthday party this Saturday," Marcus said, his words coming out in a rush. "It's gonna be at the arcade, and then we're having pizza at my house after. My mom said I could invite whoever I want, and, well, I want you to come." Elliot stared at the envelope in Marcus's hand. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst out of his chest. With slightly shaking fingers, he reached out and took the invitation. "Really?" he asked again, just like he had at recess. It seemed to be the only word he could say today. Marcus nodded, looking more confident now. "Yeah, it'll be fun. Plus, I heard you're really good at Space Invaders, and I need someone to help me beat the high score." A warm feeling spread through Elliot's chest as he carefully put the invitation in his backpack. It wasn't just an invitation to a party. It was an invitation to belong, to be just another kid again. For the first time in months, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things at school would be okay. The hallway was almost empty as Elliot gathered his books from his locker. Most kids had already rushed out to enjoy the warm afternoon, but he was taking his time, still floating on the happiness of Marcus's party invitation. The sound of clicking heels against the linoleum floor made him look up. Mrs. Green stood there, her usual stern expression replaced by something softer. Her hands were clasped together, and for the first time since Elliot had known her, she looked uncertain. She wasn't carrying her usual clipboard or wearing her usual frown. "Elliot," she said quietly, "might I have a word with you?" Elliot's stomach did a small flip. He nodded slowly, closing his locker door with a gentle click. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mrs. Green took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "That day in the cafeteria with your lunch, I was wrong, very wrong." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "And it wasn't just about the fried chicken. I've been unfair to you for months now." Elliot stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. This was the same Mrs. Green who had thrown away his lunch, who had whispered about his father, who had made him feel small and unwanted. But now she looked different. Smaller somehow. More human. "You see," she continued, "I've spent my whole life believing that people can't change, that once someone makes bad choices, that's who they are forever." She glanced out the window, where Jack's motorcycle was parked in the school lot. "Your father proved me wrong." A group of students passed by, their voices echoing in the hallway. Mrs. Green waited until they were gone before speaking again. "I've watched him these past months," she admitted. "I've seen how hard he works to be better, to be there for you. I've noticed how he volunteers at the community center, how he helps elderly Mrs. Wilson with her grocery shopping every Tuesday." She smiled slightly. "And most importantly, I've seen how much he loves you." Elliot felt his eyes growing warm. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. But what really showed me my mistake was you, Elliot, Mrs. Green said softly. Your courage in standing up for your father, your kindness even when people were cruel to you, including me. You showed more character than I did, and I'm supposed to be the adult. Just then, the main doors opened, and Jack walked in, his boots making heavy sounds on the floor. He stopped short when he saw Mrs. Green talking to Elliot, his expression guarded. But Mrs. Green turned to him with a genuine smile. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, straightening her shoulders. "You have an extraordinary son, and—" She took another deep breath. "I owe you an apology as well. I judged you without giving you a chance. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Elliot watched as his father's expression changed from surprise to understanding. Jack nodded slowly, respect reflecting in his eyes, the same respect now visible in Mrs. Green's gaze. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," Elliot said quietly. "I accept your apology." Mrs. Green's eyes glistened with tears as she looked between father and son. For the first time since that day in the cafeteria, there was no judgment in her eyes, no disapproval in her stance, just simple, honest respect. The aroma of fried chicken filled the Sullivans' small backyard. Jack stood at the grill, his leather jacket traded for a simple white apron that read, "World's Best Dad," a recent gift from Elliot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their modest lawn, where a handful of folding chairs circled a wooden picnic table. Elliot darted between the kitchen and backyard, carrying paper plates and plastic utensils with careful determination. His blonde hair caught the sunlight, making it look like spun gold. The screen door creaked and slammed with each trip, but nobody minded the noise. It was the sound of home, of family, of belonging. "Need any help there, buddy?" Jack called out, flipping a piece of chicken with practiced ease. The crispy skin sizzled, releasing another wave of mouth-watering scents. "I got it, Dad," Elliot beamed, proud to be helping. He arranged the plates with careful precision, making sure everything was perfect. This wasn't just any dinner. It was their celebration, their moment to acknowledge how far they'd come. The backyard wasn't fancy. The grass needed mowing in spots, and the fence could use a fresh coat of paint. But today, with streamers hanging from the trees and a "Welcome Home" banner, even though they hadn't gone anywhere, it felt magical. Mrs. Wilson from next door arrived first, carrying her famous apple pie. She'd been one of the first in town to give Jack a chance, letting him help with her groceries when others still crossed the street to avoid him. She patted Elliot's cheek as she passed, commenting on how tall he was getting. A few of Elliot's classmates showed up with their parents, including Marcus, whose party invitation had meant so much. The adults seemed relaxed now, chatting with Jack about everyday things like weather and local sports. No one mentioned his past or gave him suspicious looks. They just saw him as Elliot's dad, the guy who coached Little League on weekends and volunteered at the community center. "The chicken smells just like Mom's," Elliot said softly, standing beside his father at the grill. There was no sadness in his voice, just warmth and appreciation. Jack rested his hand on Elliot's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "That's because she gave me her secret recipe. Said it was time I learned to make your favorite meal." The evening air was perfect. Not too hot, not too cool. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze as everyone gathered around the picnic table. Jack watched as Elliot took his seat, surrounded by friends who now saw him for who he was, not for who his father used to be. "Before we eat," Jack said, clearing his throat, "I just want to say thank you. To all of you for being here, for giving us a chance." His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with emotion. "And especially to you, Elliot. You never stopped believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Elliot stood up from his chair and wrapped his arms around his father's waist. "Thanks for being my dad," he whispered, just loud enough for Jack to hear. "I'm really glad you're here." The moment hung in the air, sweet and precious. Around them, their guests smiled, some wiping away tears. Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, and even Marcus's dad, who'd once been one of their biggest critics, nodded approvingly. The sound of laughter and friendly conversation filled their backyard as everyone began to eat. Elliot sat next to his father, their shoulders touching, sharing smiles and secret glances. This was their victory celebration, not just for surviving the hard times, but for building something beautiful from them. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Jack sorted through the mail at the breakfast table. Elliot sat across from him, munching on cereal and occasionally sharing bits of his plans for the upcoming school science fair. A plain white envelope caught Jack's attention. No fancy letterhead, just his name and address, written in familiar block letters. "Hold on a second, buddy," Jack said, his voice softening as he recognized the handwriting. He carefully opened the envelope, his weathered hands steady despite the flutter of anticipation in his chest. The letter was from Mike Thompson, an old Marine buddy he'd served with years ago. They'd lost touch after Jack's life had taken its darker turns, but Mike had always been one of the good ones, steady, reliable, and fair-minded. Elliot watched his father's face as he read, noting how his expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to hope. "What is it, Dad?" Jack looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with possibility. "Remember me telling you about my friend Mike from the Marines?" When Elliot nodded, he continued, "Well, he's running a veterans center here in town. Says they could use someone with my background to help out." The Veterans Center was a respected institution in their community. It provided support services, counseling, and job training for returning service members. Jack had walked past it many times but had never dared to go in, feeling like his past mistakes had forfeited his right to be part of that world again. "Mike says they need someone who understands both military life and, well, the struggles that come after." Jack's voice grew quiet as he reread a particular passage. "He thinks my experience could help others who are trying to find their way back." Elliot's face lit up with pride. "That's perfect for you, Dad. You're really good at helping people." He pushed his cereal bowl aside and leaned forward eagerly. "Remember when you helped Mr. Peterson fix his motorcycle? He still tells everyone about that." Jack smiled at his son's enthusiasm. The letter trembled slightly in his hands as he considered the opportunity. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to use his past, both the good and the bad, to make a difference. To help others who were walking the difficult path he knew all too well. "It would be part-time at first," Jack explained, running his fingers over the paper. "Mostly working with veterans who are having trouble adjusting to civilian life, helping them navigate the system, find resources, that kind of thing." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at their neighborhood. The same streets that had once seemed filled with judgment now held possibility. The Veterans Center was only a few blocks away. He could see its roof from here, the American flag waving proudly in the morning breeze. "What do you think, buddy?" Jack turned back to Elliot, his expression serious. "It would mean some changes to our schedule and people would be counting on me." Elliot jumped up from his chair and hugged his father. "I think you'd be amazing at it, Dad. You always say everyone deserves a second chance, right?" Jack wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders, feeling a surge of gratitude for this child who believed in him so completely. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Mike had included in the letter. "Hey, Mike," Jack's voice was steady and clear. "It's Jack Sullivan, about that job at the Veterans Center. I'd like to accept." The warmth in Mike's response confirmed what Jack was feeling in his heart. He'd found more than just a job. He'd found a place where his experiences, even the difficult ones, could serve a greater purpose. A place where he truly belonged. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the school parking lot as Elliot walked toward the entrance, his backpack slung confidently over his shoulder. His steps were light, almost bouncy, so different from the hesitant shuffle he'd had at the beginning of the year. The familiar brick building that had once felt like a fortress of judgment now looked welcoming, its doors wide open to greet the students on their final day. Several of his classmates waved as he passed, genuine smiles replacing the wary looks they'd given him months ago. "Hey, Elliot," called Tommy, one of the boys who had once joined in the teasing. "Save me a seat at the assembly?" "Sure thing," Elliot replied, his voice clear and strong. He no longer felt the need to duck his head or avoid eye contact. The weight of his father's past had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by pride in how far they'd both come. Inside the bustling hallway, decorations celebrated the end of the school year. Colorful paper chains hung from the ceiling, and student artwork lined the walls. Mrs. Green stood by her classroom door, and when she caught Elliot's eye, she gave him a warm nod. The transformation in their relationship still amazed him. Her earlier judgment had melted away like winter snow in spring. As students filed into the gymnasium for the final assembly, Elliot spotted his father sitting among the other parents. Jack's leather jacket was gone, replaced by a crisp button-down shirt, though his tattoos still peeked out from beneath the sleeves. He looked comfortable, at ease among the other adults who now greeted him with friendly gestures rather than suspicious glances. The familiar squeak of sneakers on polished floors filled the gym as students found their places on the bleachers. Elliot sat between Tommy and Sarah, feeling a surge of happiness when they automatically made room for him. Principal Jensen stepped up to the microphone, her usual formal demeanor softened by a genuine smile. "As we conclude another school year," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "I want to talk about something more important than grades or achievements. I want to talk about growth, about change, and about the power of forgiveness." The room fell silent, and Elliot felt his heart swell with anticipation. Principal Jensen's gaze swept across the assembled students and parents, lingering for a moment on Jack. "This year, our community learned valuable lessons about judgment and second chances. We witnessed the remarkable journey of one of our parents, Mr. Jack Sullivan, who showed us that a person's past does not define their future." Elliot sat up straighter, his chest tight with emotion. He could see other parents nodding in agreement, some even turning to smile at Jack. "Through his dedication to both his son and our community," Principal Jensen continued, "Mr. Sullivan has earned not just our forgiveness, but our respect. His story reminds us that when we open our hearts to change, we all become stronger." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Elliot looked at his father, seeing the mixture of humility and joy on his face. Jack's eyes met his son's, and in that moment they shared a look of pure understanding. They had made it through the storm together, and they had emerged stronger. As the applause continued, Principal Jensen's words rang true. Their community had indeed grown stronger through forgiveness. Elliot felt the pride surge through him, knowing that his father's redemption story would be remembered not as a tale of shame, but as one of triumph. The aroma of grilled chicken filled the backyard as Jack stood at the grill, expertly flipping pieces with practiced ease. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the gathering, where neighbors and new friends mingled on the freshly mowed lawn. Colorful paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, strung between trees that provided patches of cool shade. Elliot darted between groups of adults, carrying paper plates loaded with potato salad and coleslaw. His blonde hair caught the sunlight, and his face glowed with happiness as he played his role as co-host. Several of his classmates had come with their parents, running around the yard in an impromptu game of tag. "Need any help there, Jack?" called Mr. Peterson from next door, approaching the grill with 2 cold sodas in hand. Just months ago, he'd been one of the neighbors who'd kept their distance. Now, he offered one of the drinks to Jack with a genuine smile. "Thanks, Bill," Jack replied, accepting the soda. His tattoos no longer drew suspicious stares. Instead, they'd become conversation starters about his military service and journey to redemption. "Pretty good turnout, huh?" Mrs. Green sat at one of the picnic tables, chatting animatedly with Elliot's teacher and several other parents. Her earlier judgment had transformed into vocal support for Jack's efforts in the community. She caught Elliot's eye and waved, her smile reaching her eyes. "Dad!" Elliot called out, running up to the grill. "Tommy says his dad wants to know if you'll help coach Little League next season." His eyes sparkled with excitement, already imagining spending more time with his father. Jack ruffled Elliot's hair affectionately. "We'll see, buddy. That might be fun." The simple interaction drew warm glances from nearby guests, who saw not a former outlaw, but a devoted father sharing a moment with his son. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on the comfortable rhythm of a community truly at ease with itself. Children played, adults laughed, and stories were shared over plates of perfectly grilled chicken. The recipe, Jack had proudly told everyone, came from Elliot's mother, a way of honoring the meal that had once caused so much trouble, but now brought people together. "You've done good here, Jack," Principal Jensen said quietly, stopping by the grill. "Both of you have." She smiled at Elliot, who was showing his friends how to make the special dipping sauce his father had taught him. The sky began to shift into deeper blues and soft oranges as the day wound down. Guests gradually said their goodbyes, carrying empty dishes and full hearts. The last rays of sunlight painted everything in golden hues, and the paper lanterns began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Jack and Elliot sat together on the back porch steps, shoulders touching, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The remnants of the party, happy voices fading down the street, the lingering scent of grilled food, the gentle evening breeze, wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. "Dad?" Elliot leaned against his father's solid presence. "Remember when you first came to school that day? When Mrs. Green threw away my lunch?" Jack nodded, draping his arm around his son's shoulders. The memory no longer carried its sting. Instead, it marked the beginning of their journey together. "I'm really glad you stayed," Elliot said simply, his voice full of contentment. "Even when things got hard." Jack pulled his son closer, feeling the deep peace that came from knowing they'd weathered the storm together. Around them, their yard still held evidence of the day's celebration. Chairs scattered in conversational groups, paper lanterns swaying gently, the grill cooling in the evening air. But more than that, it held the promise of many more gatherings to come, of a future built on trust and redemption. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.
Then he met Mary, and then that's when he sort of stopped that whole bare knuckle boxing stuff because, you know, didn't want to get too hurt.